Hello, everyone. Our case study this week is Doan versus the City of New Halidart. This case is based off of Chapter 11, which is all about employee relations. In our group is myself, Samantha Brooke, Xiaofei Shu, and Ryan Hawkins. Within our presentation, we will be going over the case/incident, location and decision makers, the problem, key mistakes, significance, approaches to a resolution, questions 1 and 2, and discussion questions. So, here's an overview of this case. So, Carl Doan has been an employee of the City of New Halidart for 16 years as a dispatcher. The City of New Halidart gives employees a new handbook every 2 years which outlines workplace provisions. Under Section 11.2 of the handbook, the city retains all rights with regard to the maintenance of discipline at the workplace, including the right to demote or discharge for just cause. The City of New Halidart conducts yearly performance appraisals based on job knowledge, ability to work with others, dependability/accuracy, and handling unexpected vehicle maintenance and operator absences. Scores range from 1 to 5, with 1 indicating unsatisfactory performance and 5 indicating outstanding performance. Doan's average work group is 3.9. Doan has been said to be a good worker who is dependable but does not take things very seriously. Brian Campbell is the supervisor for Doan's division and has been said to be relatively good supervisor, although he has a bad temper and tends to have angry outbursts 2 to 3 times a year. Employees fear becoming Campbell's next victim as these outbursts include verbal attacks towards employees. Okay, so now that I've explained the important factors that surround the case, I'm now going to explain the incident that occurred between Carl Doan and Brian Campbell. So, one Friday afternoon, employees were taking their coffee break in the break room. Doan and Campbell have their usual spots next to each other against the wall of the room so that they can see what is going on in the room. Doan put his sandwich and water bottle down at his spot when he noticed he had a small cut on his arm, and so he proceeded to the washroom to clean his cut and put a bandage on it. When Doan got back to the break room, he noticed that his sandwich and water bottle was moved to the side, and Campbell was sitting in his spot due to another worker taking the spot that Campbell usually occupied. So, the next thing I'm going to be going over is the conversation between Doan and Campbell. So, Doan stated, "Excuse me, Brian, but you are in my spot." Campbell turned to Doan, gave him a slight smile, and replied, "I don't see your name anywhere on the table. Find a spot somewhere else. And that is an order from your supervisor." Doan refused to back down. He said, "My drink and sandwich are right in front of you." "I'm not kidding, Brian. Get out of my spot." Brian became angry. He smashed his fist on Doan's sandwich and dropped his pen into Doan's water bottle. "Take your sandwich and drink and go somewhere else," he ordered. "I'm not letting you run the garage." At this point, Doan moved behind Campbell, grabbed the chair he was sitting on, and jerked it backward. Campbell fell on the floor. The water he had in his hand also fell, and some of it splashed on his body and his face. While some of the other employees witnessing the incident laughed, a hush fell over the room when it became evident that Campbell was actually hurt. He went to the emergency room at the local hospital and was diagnosed with a bruised tailbone. So, as a result of the incident, this is what happened. Campbell was required to miss 8 days of work. Then, the HR manager, Alex Morissette, met with a number of employees. After reviewing all of the evidence and meeting with Campbell and Doan, the city of New Halidart decided to terminate Doan, who was notified 3 days after the incident. 8 days after the incident, Doan wrote a formal letter apologizing for his conduct, stating, "I didn't mean to hurt Brian, and I'm sorry for my actions." So, this case is located within the city of New Halidart, and the main decision maker in this case is the human resources manager named Alex Morissette. Because Alex met with other employees who had witnessed the incident to get more information on of what had happened, and he also met with Doan and Campbell to get both sides of the story. So, Alex made the final decision to terminate Doan's employment. There are many problems that we can address from this case and this incident. Brian Campbell took Carl Doan's place while he was going to the washroom. Carl Doan kindly asked Brian Campbell if he could return the seat to him, and Brian Campbell responded rudely and moved out of his supervisor status. After two firm refusals from Carl Doan, Brian Campbell acted unethically with Carl Doan's food and water. Carl Doan hits back at Brian Campbell with extreme behavior. Is there justification for the employer to dismiss Carl Doan, or should consideration be given to punitive measures for Brian Campbell's misconduct? So there are many key mistakes regarding the incident between Doan and Campbell. The key mistakes that Campbell presented are as follows. Without telling Carl Doan, he robbed him of the position he had occupied and even removed his sandwich and water. After Carl Doan's first friendly reminder, Brian Campbell said the table was not marked with anyone else's name and he did not want to return it. He asked Carl Doan to find a new table to eat by the order of his supervisor, and after being rejected again by Carl Doan, he hits Doan's sandwich with his fist and drops a pen into Doan's water bottle. In the end, he asked Carl Doan to find a new seat in an orderly tone and claimed that Doan would not be allowed to run the garage. The key mistakes that Doan presented are as follows. Doan disobeyed Campbell's orders and insisted that Brian Campbell leave the position he had taken. He was provoked by Brian's rude words and actions, and Doan went into extreme action. That is, he grabbed the chair Campbell was sitting on, causing him to fall to the ground, and in doing so, Brian was taken to the emergency room with a bruised tailbone. The significance of this case and Chapter 11 is the importance of employee relation practices, which includes employee relations, employee counseling, employee discipline, dismissal, employee misconduct, and managing the dismissal. So, other approaches to handling the situation. So, first, both Doan and Campbell should have been disciplined as they've both acted out in ways they should not have. Because Campbell has a bad temper, the organization should have given Doan another chance, but still held him responsible for his actions by doing something like suspending him for a while. As for Campbell, he should have received suspension as well, as he needs to undergo some serious behavioral counseling before another situation happens and he provokes another employee into doing something that could terminate their employment. We could have also used a positive discipline approach. So, by using this type of approach, both parties would need to take responsibility for their actions. HR would need to hold a meeting with both individuals and document which changes that they need to make, as well as their commitments in doing so. After some time, HR would need to follow up with both individuals and see if they have made any progress.
Question 1. Make arguments for both the employer and employee. Does the employer of the city of Halidar have just cause to terminate Carl Doan? The employer's argument for termination. The city of Halidar takes any instance involving physical altercation as serious offenses. The company interviewed eyewitnesses of the incident occurring last Friday and met with both Mr. Doan and Mr. Campbell privately. After the investigation was concluded, the company declared Mr. Doan's actions as unacceptable. This is because there is evidence to believe Mr. Doan's behavior was an act of willful disobedience, which, if you're unaware, willful disobedience is an employee who refuses to obey the lawful and reasonable order of the employer and is in breach of the employment contract. From eyewitness accounts, Mr. Campbell had instructed Mr. Doan to take your sandwich and go. Mr. Campbell instructed Mr. Doan to stand down. Mr. Doan retaliated with aggression. The company followed the process and informed Mr. Doan on Thursday of his termination. We believe the sinew how darts can be broken down into three points. First of which is the City of New Haldor Employee Handbook, Section 11.2. As stated in Figure 1.1, Section 11.2 of the Employee Handbook states that the City of New Haldor retains the right to the maintenance of discipline at the workplace, including the right to demote or discharge for just cause. Just cause applies the legal grounds for termination involving employee misconduct. The employee handbooks provide each employee to act as a guideline for employees to understand company objectives, their code of ethics, and behavior standards. Mr. Doan was recorded receiving the last updated edition of the employee handbook last January. Moving forward, we're going to look at Mr. Doan's history of disciplinary action. His first citation came 28 months ago, where Mr. Doan had slept in and was absent for 25 minutes to shift. The company took corrective disciplinary action against Mr. Doan and issued a written warning for his tardiness. His second citation comes 16 months ago, where Mr. Doan was one of five involved in a prank involving inappropriate workplace behavior. The company views matters of workplace behavior very sternly. After a proper investigation of this incident, the company suspended Mr. Doan and the other five employees for their behavior. All parties were informed that any more incidents of this behavior will result in their termination. This was an act of preventive discipline to prevent further infractions of inappropriate behavior amongst employees. The final incident was an altercation that emerged between Mr. Doan and Mr. Campbell over the ownership of a tail seat. After reviewing all accounts of the incident occurring last Friday, Mr. Doan was accounted as the first to take physical course of action against Mr. Doan. With that being said, the employer then have reason to believe that Mr. Doan now on three different accounts has failed to follow the employee guidelines outlined in the handbook. First, tardiness, then inappropriate workplace behavior, and now willful disobedience and physical altercation. After the second citation, Mr. Doan was given confirmation that the city of New Halder does not stand for any inappropriate workplace behavior of any kind, and any further instance would result in termination. That being said, we believe the city of New Halder demonstrated proper corrective disciplinary action for Mr. Doan prior to the final incident. After reviewing Mr. Doan's actions, it is justified of the company to terminate Mr. Doan effectively, as he had written notice followed by suspension for two previous incidents. His third and final incident was a fight, which in most cases is not dealt with by the means of progressive discipline on the first offense. Moving from the employer argument, let's look at Mr. Doan's argument as an employee. From the perspective of an employee, disciplinary action must be taken against Brian Campbell as well. Employees have said on rare occasions, about 3 to 4 per year, he has an outburst of anger and is verbally abusive towards his co-workers. Mr. Campbell is accounted telling Mr. Doan condescendingly, "I don't see your name anywhere on the table. Find a spot elsewhere," and that is an order from your supervisor. And then Mr. Campbell was accounted to smashing Mr. Doan's sandwich, saying, "Take your sandwich and drink and go somewhere else. I'm not letting you run this garage." These quotes prove that Mr. Campbell was the first to show any aggression during the incident. It would appear Mr. Campbell's temper got out of his control and he smashed Mr. Doan's food. Not only is Mr. Campbell's behavior disrespectful, but as a supervisor, this behavior is horribly unacceptable. Overall, it would appear there needs to be corrective action taken for Mr. Campbell's egotistic behavior. This incident has highlighted his potential for verbal abuse due to his temper. Statements such as, "That's an order from your supervisor," and "I'm not letting you run this garage," are condescending in their nature. It was Mr. Campbell's temper and ego that enticed Mr. Doan to act out. As corrective action, we would recommend suspension and counseling for Mr. Campbell to help resolve issues and help cope with his anger for future situations. So, moving on, we wanted to dive into more reasons why this problem may have arose in their organization. The first of which is we have reason to believe there's an interpersonal conflict between Mr. Doan and Mr. Campbell. So, we believe this problem arose from the organizational issues that were left unresolved. There's a potential for interpersonal conflict between Mr. Doan and Mr. Campbell. After reviewing the case, the evidence suggests that Mr. Doan doesn't take his work environment very seriously, while Mr. Campbell is a supervisor who doesn't tolerate poor performers and has an inconsistent personality when angered. Right there seems to be discrepancies and differences in their personalities. After doing further research and studying, a study on the causes of anger in the workplace suggests three main triggers for employee outbursts. Feeling one is being treated unjustly by their supervisor. Two, when one feels another person is obstructing their goals. And lastly, when there's a personality conflict and differences in attitudes, as presented in the case between Mr. Doan and Mr. Campbell. Furthermore, we're going to look at the impact of negative emotions and stress on their organization. Furthermore, from reviewing this case, there's an underlying issue presented. Mr. Campbell has made employees feel fearful, unrelaxed near him, and frightened by the inconsistent nature of his anger. We believe there's stress within the organization stemming from Mr. Campbell's behavior. We researched the impact of emotional regulation, and it was found in a study of the impact of workplace emotions by Joyce E. Bono in 2007 that participants reported the most positive emotions when interacting with their coworkers. Mean positive emotions experience was 3.75, and fewest positive emotions when interacting with their supervisors, which was a 3.045 mean. The results from the study suggest that leadership behaviors of supervisors have lasting effects on the organization. Research suggests that the more often individuals must regulate their emotions, that the emotional regulation was correlated with lower rates of job satisfaction and higher levels of stress. From analyzing the case, the inconsistency and hostility of Mr. Campbell's temper has potentially made individuals fearful and has made individuals fearful and unrelaxed around him, pardon me, making employees regulate how they feel at work around him, creating higher levels of stress, which we're going to go into why that stress has affected this situation. Overall, stress may be able to explain Mr. Doan's actions in the incident. From the case, it is stated Mr. Doan is a single father with two children, one of which requires special care. And on top of this, he feels unsettled around Brian Campbell at work. Therefore, it's quite evident Mr. Doan could experience varying degrees of stress. The results of another study on the relationship between work stress and aggression amongst employees by Naseem and Ahmed in 2014 suggests that there's a significant positive relationship between work stress and aggression at significant levels of 0.05. And from their study, they were able to determine R value of 0.58. This was because when employees feel high stress, they exhibit more aggression than usual. In stressful situations, individuals are more likely to use anger as a way of expressing high stress in the workplace. So, from correlating that to the case, Mr. Campbell had instructed Mr. Doan and smashed his sandwich out of anger, creating a stressful situation on top of the already present stressors in Mr. Doan's life. Therefore, it is quite possible that Mr. Campbell's temper was enough for Mr. Doan to react out of fear and stress. Lastly, I wanted to take a chance to look at performance management, maybe give insight on how to cancel an employee with temper issues. So, employee aggression. Pardon me. If the witnesses of Mr. Campbell's temper had reported him to human resources for verbal abuse, he could have been recommended the proper counseling. Counseling is effective at helping employees understand their behavior, resolve an issue, or learn to cope with situations. Think of anger management issues as a performance management situation. Don't ignore its impact on others and don't neglect the individual's own stressors. Overall, proper counseling could have prevented this situation and also created a less fearful work culture surrounding Mr. Carable. So, this would be the conversation model for counseling an employee anger. First, thank the employee for meeting with you and sharing the concerns you have surrounding their behavior. Define clearly how and why the behavior affects organizational performance to them. Secondly, listen actively to the employee and allow them to explain the situation from his or her point of view. Thirdly, discover underlying stressors contributing to the behavior. Share suggested solutions on how to overcome challenges involving the work and behavior. Fourth and finally, ensure verbal agreement from the employee on a course of action to solve their situation. And don't forget to arrange a follow up date to ensure they are committed to making progress.
The question 2. How would you recommend communicating information about the termination with the employees who had observed this incident and about respect for work practice expected in the future? According to Susan in the article How to Demonstrate Respect in the Workplace, the behaviors that demonstrate respect in work practice include the following. Treat people with courtesy and kindness. Encourage colleagues to express ideas. Never insult, abuse, or demean employees. Over time, a series of seemingly insignificant behaviors can add up to bullying. Pay attention to your body language, tone of voice, expressing in all interactions at work. Improve your ability to interact with colleagues and supervisors based on your awareness of dealing with people and your emotional intelligence. This will help you connect with empathy and better understand the people you work with. On this basis, Supervisor Brian has not shown respect in his previous work practice, and throughout Brian and Dawn's battle over seat ownership, Brian also highlighted his own disrespectful behavior, such as destroying employee food and ordering employees. So when the employer communicates to employees about Dawn's discrimination and educates employees about respectful behavior in the future. The first condition is that Brian is also punished, and the publication of Dawn and Brian disrespect for work practice and disciplinary results. In this case, a recommendation will be valid. This can be combined with evidence given by the employees in this case. Before some of employees have complained that Brian is a good supervisor most of the time, but when he has a bad temper, he will show a different personality, such as verbally insulting employees. The employees were scared to be Brian's next attacker. Look back at that incident. Brian also showed the same bad temper as the employees remembered, namely, Dorm faced Brian's abusive, dominant, and unethical behavior, and Dorm's aggressive behavior without continuing his dissatisfaction paid the price for disrespectful work practice. However, if those employees learned that the company didn't punish Brian for the incident, it would be difficult for the employers to recommend respectful work practice. They would even consider Brian to be a supervisor without punishment. Therefore, before communicating with these employees, the employer needs to execute the improper behavior between Dawn and Brian fairly and publish the details and the results of the improper behavior of both parties to other employees that serve as a warning, which also facilitates communicating some of the requirements for respecting work practice in the future with employees. Detailed examples of the reasons for the final decision to terminate Dawn, including all incidents of employee discipline violations. It not only can reduce employee misunderstandings, but also can help employees realize the importance of respecting work practice. It was mentioned in previous Dawn employee disciplinary actions. 16 months ago, Dawn and other employees make a job to celebrate Brian's birthday by putting laxatives in Brian's birthday cake. As a result, Brian fell ill and was struck at his job. Another violation of employee discipline was when Dawn fell asleep before his shift and was late for work. In my opinion, before the Dawn and Brian incident, Dawn had two employee disrespectful behaviors on work practices, which led to the final employer's decision to terminate. But for other employees, they don't know the real situation. They might have misunderstood that Brian still minds Dawn's jokes, and this seat-related conflict gives them the chance to fire Dawn. Coupled with the employer's indifference to Brian's behavior in such incidents, the employees are even more misunderstood. So employers must expand the clear message that Dawn's dismissal occurred when communicating the outcome of the relevant incident to those employees who observed the incident. Overall, employers must treat Brian and Doris' disrespectful work practice equally in the whole thing and list this bad behavior to other employees as a warning. Not only that, I suggest that employers need to emphasize that the identity of the supervisor should not be used as the right to abuse others at will in the process of communication, but must also abide by the discipline that employees should have. Last but not least, employers must provide honest and clear feedback on the specific reasons for donors dismissal to prevent misunderstandings among employees. This week, we leave you guys with 3 questions. The first one, if you are an HR manager, what justifications do you need to terminate an employee? The second, how many citations would it take for you to believe termination is most suitable after an incident? The third one, in this case, how would you have handled the situation between Campbell and Dawn? This is our reference. Thanks for listening. We look forward to your comments.